listening to a One Pint Stand, a Minnesota craft beer podcast that tells the stories of craft beer in Minnesota and beyond. So kick back, relax, and grab a cold one. The show starts now. Hello, my name is Dan Bobian, and I write, produce, and host a One Pint Stand. I'm ecstatic that you're listening. This episode of a One Pint Stand is proudly sponsored by Wandering Leaf Brewing Company. Wandering Leaf Brewing is a fantastic, family-friendly brewery that combines lush greenery with dynamic craft beers. Their spacious taproom is located just south of Highland Park on West 7th Street in St. Paul. So make sure you check them out and tell them that a One Pint Stand sent you. On this episode of a One Pint Stand, you are in for an amazing treat. This show is all about the history of brewing and beer in Minnesota. It was recorded at a live event that I did at Forgotten Star Brewing in front of a fantastic audience. The panel consisted of some industry luminaries that dazzled the audience with their expertise and passion. I want to thank Doug Hoverson, Bill Lindeke, and Chris German for joining me for the show. For me, this show was special. I was quite nervous, and I was so touched by the number of people who showed up to hear some beer stories. I never really know how this show is consumed. Sure, I can get analytics, but there's never any in-the-moment feedback where I know whether something was interesting or funny because of a reaction from a listener. You all showed up and showed out, and it felt amazing. Thank you so much for being a part of that. People who have found this show and have told others about it are the reason why Forgotten Star approached me to do this event. You're all the reason why two authors and a sales rep for one of the largest maltsters in the world thought it would be a good idea to join me for a panel on beer history. I also want to thank Ben and Matt from Forgotten Star for ensuring that the event was publicized and ran smoothly. The sound was wonderful and the beers were stellar. I also want to thank Matt for starting the show off and giving some of the historical context for Forgotten Star and what that location used to be. Now, if you were thinking that you missed out on the live show and wanted to see the John Lovitz look-alike in action, you don't have to wait very long for the next one. I will be recording another live show at Spiral Brewing in Hastings to celebrate their anniversary party on Saturday, April 19th from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. The focus of that show will be the beer history of Hastings and women in brewing. So I hope to see you there in the Spiral Brewery taproom for that. It will really be a fun time, and I'm just flattered that they invited me to do that. So I'm very much looking forward to it. Now, let's head out to Forgotten Star's classy event space for my live show on the history of beer in Minnesota. Cheers. All right, fabulous. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I know it's the opening weekend of March Madness, and that's always usually prime sweatpants couch time. So a lot of you are making a great sacrifice to be here, and I'm very thankful for it. So before we get started, we've got a lot of fun for you all tonight. We're going to do a deep dive into Minnesota beer history. But first, I thought we would talk with the head brewer here at Forgotten Star, Matt Asay. Thank you so much for being here. Let's give a round of applause for Matt. He has literally had his hands in what we're drinking, and it's delicious. It's real delicious.
There it is.
Yeah.
All right. Just real quick about the space that you're occupying. So this was the Northern Pump Company in the early 1900s. I know a lot of kids like to make jokes about that now, because we're in the 2008. Wow, prepped. Good for you. But in the early 1900s, they used to make water pumps for the fire department. And once World War II rolled around, they switched to making artillery for the Navy. And so those stars in the E that you see on the stacks outside, those are Navy Battle E Awards, and those are excellence and efficiency for production efforts towards the war effort. So the site that we currently occupy is a boiler room, and these coal trains used to roll by, dump the coal, and guys used to shovel it, throw it in the boiler that powered the whole facility. So everything that you saw driving in used to be the largest single-site facility in Minnesota until they built the Mall of America. And they chopped it up and repurposed it, and they thought a great way to showcase what a good job they did was to throw a brewery in at the end, because you can't make good beer without clean water. So here we are.
I want to tell you, this is not my first rodeo here at Forgotten Star. I've always been a fan of the beers. I'm drinking the dry Irish stout, but you've got some excellent beers on tap tonight. Do you want to give us a little spiel about those?
Yeah, I mean, so if you get a chance, drink the Bach tonight, because it is the last keg, and it is our most award-winning beer that we have on tap. So it has won a gold or silver medal at every major competition except for the World Beer Cup. So it's very good Bach. Cream ale and the Triples is best, also nationally award-winning beers. So if you get a chance, those are the ones to do.
Okay. Well, Matt, thank you so much for letting us invade your boiler room tonight. I'm real excited. That would explain the temperature. It's a little warm in here. Nice and warm. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's give Matt a round of applause. All right. Fabulous. Okay, so give you the logistics of this evening. Okay, Bill, come on. Saddle up. We're going to be this is like Bill and I went to high school together. Yes, I know you're all thinking, you graduated high school? I did, in 4 years too, so that's very exciting. So we are really excited about tonight to have a wonderful discussion about beer history in Minnesota. A little housekeeping thing. We will be doing an intermission like halfway through to go refresh your beers, but this is very free form. If you have to get up and go do a lap, play around a bingo, come back. It's fine. You do you. Live your best life tonight. So this is a one-pint stand. Is there anybody who's never heard of a one-pint stand in the room? All right. Okay, good. Well, hopefully, you dialed me up on your Spotify if you're, have a commute or like to hear somebody who sounds like a DJ but looks like John Lovitz. That's very exciting. I am thrilled. I love doing this podcast because I love bringing people together first and foremost, but also it's a wonderful opportunity to tell some great beer stories. And holy cats, we've got a panel for you here. So I would like to start off by, let's go, I was going to say clockwise, but we're not sitting in a circle. So we'll just go one by one. If you all could say your name, your connection to beer in Minnesota, your favorite Minnesota historical beer tidbit, and the first Minnesota beer you ever tried.
Hi, my name is Bill Indicke. I wrote a book called Closing Time, which is a history of saloons, taverns, dives, and watering holes of the Twin Cities. It's a bar history, basically, going from Pig's Eyes Tavern to the present day. And my favorite beer tidbit is Jorg's Brewing. It's a secret spot. It's the first beer brewery in St. Paul, 1840, I think. And the current owner rebooted this brand, and now they're located on the east side. And it's a true gem. They have stuff that you'll never see anywhere in the Midwest, let alone in St. Paul. So go to Jorg's and appreciate the history of it. Probably my first Minnesota beer. Geez, that's really personal, but I don't know.
This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay.
By the end, we're going to know your favorite kind of socks and your favorite brand of peanut butter.
I'm a huge Summit stan, and I love EPA, and I still drink it all the time, so I'll just say that.
I can attest to Summit EPA being a fantastic beer. My name is Chris German, and I am the regional sales manager from BSG RAR. And let's see, what's the question? The first part is...
So the first question is, what is the square root of 64? No, your connection to beer in Minnesota.
Oh, yeah. What year did we get growlers in Minnesota for the first time? Was it
2003.
2003? I feel like it's earlier, but okay, so call it 2003. I was living in Duluth, and I remember getting so excited about growlers coming to the state that I skipped work or played a little bit of hooky from work. I was selling radio advertising at the time, and I skipped work to get in line to be the very first person to buy a growler in the state in Duluth from Ficker's Brew House. But I'd say that my first beer, my Minnesota beer that I remember having, and I probably drank too much of it, I know in fact I did, would have been James Page. I believe they had like a wild rice amber lager. And I may have been about 21-ish or so, but I remember enjoying a ton of them about on New Year's Eve, and I think that was my problem. So, yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Doug.
So I'm Doug Hoverson, and I came to beer fairly early in my life. The statute of limitations is over now. So I first came of underage in Michigan, so my drinking was a little different, and besides, in Wisconsin at that point, you could pick up stuff at the gas stations on the way back. Though I'm sure the first beer I ever had was actually a sip of my dad's Molson Export, which was one of his favorites. We had relatives in Canada that would always bring a couple of cases of that down with them whenever they visited. But I'm pretty sure the first Minnesota one I would have had, and this is pre-craft, I'm sure it was Schmidt. Just had to have been regular old Schmidt beer, cold Schmidt beer here, cold beer. So I took those memories and got inspired and started digging around in history a little bit. The day job is high school history teacher, and I ended up writing this book, Land of Amber Waters, which came out 2007, and there's a whole lot of history that's happened since then, and we'll be talking about a bunch of that tonight, but I'm just pleased to be here. I also brought a copy of my 6.5-pound Wisconsin book along, and Michigan is underway.
Nice. Fabulous. Well, I said it before, I'm super excited about this panel. It's going to be great. So the first question I have for you, we talked about your first Minnesota beers, kind of things like that, but what got you interested in specifically craft beer, if you can pinpoint that moment? For me, it was a trip to Cleveland, Ohio to visit my sister and Cody. We went to, after a harrowing plane ride, it was like a 6-seater, and I think, I don't know, it was jarring, and the lady next to me thought I was freaking out, but there was a lot of turbulence. So when we got off the plane, I arrived, and they're like, hey, what do you want to do? And I was like, I could use a beer. I think that would be good. So went to Great Lakes Brewing Company, and the rest is history. But that was my kind of like intro to craft beer. I had Summit before, but that was the experience that really, really hooked me.
I don't know if you guys ever heard this before, but I was told, this must have been college or whatnot, but I think I was waiting tables at the Barley's used to have a restaurant, or maybe they still do, but in St. Louis Park there was a restaurant there. And I waited tables, and they were open 24 hours, but our shift ended at 10:30 at night, and there was a crew of us that got off about that time, and we always went out. Sometimes we went out for a beer. This time we went to the Classic and sat down at the table. My coworker, she brings a pitcher of amber beer, and she says, this is Leinenkugel's Bock, and it is special because they only make it once a year when they clean out the vats. And I'm like, whoa, I took a taste, and it had the sweet, caramely, soft, marshmallowy flavor, and it was just like your eyes roll back in your head, and you think, I can't believe it. And so that's when I got hooked. I remember in college, there was a liquor store, Happy Harry's, and they would sell single bottles of beer. So there wasn't a ton of craft brewing at the time. There was like Page and Sam Adams and Summit and whatnot, but you could go and buy like a single bottle of Sheaf Stout or Samuel Smith's or anything like that, and we would go and buy like one bottle at a crack every Vikings game. My roommates and I, we would buy a bunch of beer and just have once, and then we'd put them on top of the on top of the cabinets over the kitchen when we're done, and then had our treasures, well, recycling basically, but for us it was prizes.
When I was at Michigan, I was in the Michigan Men's Glee Club, which is nothing like Glee. And luckily, I fell in with the right group. It wasn't so much the group that was how much quantity can we get, but it was the group that had Strohsbach and Beamish Stout and some of these other things, and it was a real revelation. And right about the time I was running out of money and had to come home, there was this new little brewery starting up in Michigan called the Real Ale Company, and they had a couple of old-style English ales. And this got me thinking, different beers are actually special. They're interesting. You never hear of anyone going into a restaurant and ordering a meat. Why would you go in and order a beer when there's so much variety out there? So for some sort of either extra credit or extra deduction, on my honeymoon, I insisted that my wife and I make a stop at Shell's and take the tour down there. And this was 1987, and they had just brought out a little bit earlier their Hefeweizen and their old-style Pilsner. And after we were done with the tour guide just left and said we could stay as long as we wanted. So that was one part of a formative experience. But I was lucky to be surrounded by people who thought beer was special during my formative years. So when Summit opened, it was just a logical thing. Summit Page in those old cardboard boxes on the shelves were just, it was eye candy, and then it was mouth candy, and then it was history candy.
I don't really have a good story, Dan. I didn't drink a lot in high school or college, in fact, and it wasn't until years later that I went to England and had the pub experience you're talking about, where they it was just like the beer was the only thing I could afford in England at the time because I was pretty broke, and that was like the food was too expensive to eat, but the beer was, I could drink that, and so I drank lots of stuff. I had no idea what I was doing. I just want to tell a story though. 5 years ago, I was in Japan for my honeymoon. This was right before COVID, so we were there just before they closed everything down. But craft beer 5 years ago in Japan was an exotic thing. Like craft beer bars were this like really cool American concept that, if you drink Japanese beer, it's Sapporo or Asahi or whatever. But there are these tiny little craft breweries in Japan. And so I went to this craft brewery place, and this Asahi is like $2. And the craft brewery beer in Japan, like a regular IPA is like $20. And so I don't know why. I don't know why I went there, but I did. And then I'm watching these extremely well-dressed women like order an IPA and take it and then just sip on it for like an hour as if it's like a delicacy. And I was like, it was so funny. So I think discovering craft beer is a thing that is, still happening around the world.
Yeah.
And that's an example that comes to mind.
Well, and I remember being blown away in Minnesota when we started getting breweries opening up, and you'd go to the liquor store and there were all these different brands from places all around the country that were just new. And that sense of like, wow, this is crazy. It's like the first time you have really good prosciutto, your eyes go back in your head, your rods and cones get screwed up, and it's a religious experience. So, tonight I really want to talk about the rich history of beer in Minnesota. In a lot of ways, Minnesota is kind of flyover country. The sports teams, Doug, you said you went on your honeymoon in 1987. That was the heyday of Minnesota sports for a long time. And then the Lynx won a couple championships. And,
Go Twins!
And now we've got, we had Kirk Cousins for a while, and that was fun. Minnesota doesn't get, it's flyover country, but as I've been into craft beer and traveled around, I've gone to, Denver, Portland, Burlington, Vermont, and you go to these places, and at first you're kind of blown away. And as our craft beer scene has really matured, I feel like that gap gets smaller and smaller each time. But if you are a reader and you want to purchase some great books and learn about the Minnesota beer history, they're over here on the table, so you can do that. But I think it'd be fun to talk about that history because I believe that Minnesota stacks up quite well with a lot of other places when it comes to beer. So the first question I want to throw out, and anybody can jump in, I think a logical place to start is where did people first start enjoying beer in Minnesota, and what did that experience look like?
That sounds like it's heading down towards me. I'll hold down the pre-prohibition end here for a little while. So it's extremely likely that the first beer in Minnesota was homebrewed. And we, in fact, have some records of homebrewing happening at Fort Snelling in the early 1820s. And it came up because it was mentioned in court-martial records, though interesting, they weren't being court-martialed for home brewing. So the home brewing started, and then as the German immigrants started to move in, they brought with them the lager beer culture. So Minnesota was the first state where the first beer made was lager rather than an ale brewery. And as Bill mentioned earlier, it was Jörg's Brewing Company, which got started in 1849. Though at one point when they were failing in the late 1940s, they bumped their anniversary a year earlier so they could get a little bit of extra publicity and trying to keep things going. So the most of the beer would have been sold in quarter kegs and either at the local taverns and saloons, or farm families would buy a keg and take it home. And we really don't get to bottled beer in the home, for example, until the 1880s and 1890s. So drinking beer was really a communal thing for the vast majority of the early part of Minnesota's history.
That's really interesting to me, Bill. You mentioned, being over in England and discovering pub culture. It's to me, beer is a nice reason to get together with some people, and it's fun to kind of read in your book, Doug, that was kind of like how it all started. And then, Bill, in your book, The Closing Time, you talk a lot about some of the earlier places to go do that. What did you find in your research that kind of answers the question and can kind of put us on the old school time travel-y bar stool? Describe that for us.
Well, I think one of the big differences is that, like, in our houses in the 21st century, we have a lot of private space. We have, like, a place to watch TV. You have a big room for gatherings or whatever in your house, probably. But back in this period, if you wanted to hang out with other people, you would not be in your house. You would go somewhere else, and you would go to the saloon or the tavern, and that's where the socializing would occur. It was a big shift between public space and private space compared to today. It's almost impossible to imagine what a difference that was. So there were so many bars. I can't even tell you how many bars there were in downtown. It wasn't even called downtown St. Paul. It was just the downtown was all there was of St. Paul or of Minneapolis or of St. Anthony. And there was bars everywhere because that's where you went. And the stuff that Doug's talking about is about the German immigrants specifically brought over lager beer, which was a big difference, a cultural shift and an alcohol shift that made it more family friendly. So now women and children, it was more like Wisconsin, okay? Like you could bring people into the bar.
I could use that in my third block,
Yeah, and
they're a little rowdy after lunch. Give them a few Pilsners, calm them down.
Well, I won't. Okay, so whatever, that might happen in Wisconsin. But the vibe.
Now they're getting rid of the Department of Ed. I'm just saying, we could dream big.
The vibe in Wisconsin and in these German bars was more family oriented and like a little bit less of the extremely alcoholic like 19th century settler colonial vibe that was in the American bars, which was all about ale and whiskey. So I don't know. These places were everywhere, and the vibe was very different than anything we probably encounter today, unless you hang out in Dinkytown on a Saturday night or very extreme places. So I don't know. It's hard to. Does that sound right, Doug?
Sure. I mean, you get a lot of beer gardens, of course, starting, and that's where people are going to bring the kids, bring the dogs, bring the family, make an afternoon of it. There will be music. And, there were the saloons that were that third space gathering place, especially if you're a working man, you're in a tenement. You don't have room to sit down and talk with the guys. So you had those two different cultures based on basically whether or not women and children were allowed. And lager also tended to be a little bit lighter in alcohol content and was definitely framed as a temperance beverage. And you will sometimes see old advertisements, claiming it's non-intoxicating. Well, that didn't mean non-alcoholic, so don't start looking for the early NA beers in 1870.
I kind of feel like Michelob Golden Draft Light is also marketing itself in that way, though.
You forgot the ice draft Arita part of that name.
I want to go. So, Doug, really quick, I want to go back to something you just said. What do you mean by temperance beer?
So, the brewing industry during the time, really from its birth in Minnesota up towards Prohibition, was trying to frame itself as an alternative to the whiskey drinkers. And those people were bad, but beer was good. You could drink a lot of it and not fall down. You didn't get as angry about it. And it was also definitely associated with different ethnicities. And it was trying, in some ways, to portray the English ale drinkers at the top of the scale socially, the German lager drinkers next, and the Irishmen. They're probably over drinking the whiskey, and they are not being granted white status yet. So there's going to be a lot of the socially created ideas of what it is that's okay to drink. And so lager beer was portrayed as that really acceptable drink, which doesn't turn out to help it by 1920, but they tried.
Yeah. So we're talking about, early on, where were people going to drink? Chris, you work at RAR BSG, one of the ginormous places that processes all sorts of ingredients. How were people getting their ingredients before, you could go down to Shakopee and back up your truck and get some Pilsner malt?
Right. The first step of making beer is you have to make malt. And to make malt, back in those days, breweries had their own malt houses. So if you look at, we're talking about our pre-Prohibition times here, and so Shell's, for example, the first one that comes to my mind. They had a malt house that is caved in or filled in now. Doug, you'll remember, or you'll tell me if I'm wrong. But they made their own malt, and it wouldn't have been until after Prohibition that they, probably that malt house was decrepit and maybe not available to be turned back on again right away. And that's about the time that RAR had expanded, because they started in Wisconsin and they expanded their first malt house here in Shakopee. We were talking about it earlier. Kind of got started in 34. I think really kind of completed around 36 is what we say on our tours. So that would have been the time where there was this new demand for brewing, and barley was being pushed further west, and we were meeting that demand by building that malt house in Shakopee.
Okay.
If I can just jump in on there. Because of Minnesota and Wisconsin's relatively arid and slightly cooler climate, barley grows here a lot better than wheat does. So this really became the barley growing heartland. but you have to have a market for it. And barley isn't that great a cooking grain, but once you malt it, you can make beer, or you can keep going another step and distill it and make whiskey. And a lot of the breweries would have newspaper ads throughout this era that specifically said, we want 5,000 bushels of malt at our brewery. We want 10,000 bushels of malt at the brewery. So they were really an early component of a grain chain. Really, the whole agribusiness is getting started through a lot of the breweries.
Now go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, one thing that I think I've realized is that just like, brewers today, if they are, short of a box of hops or something like that, they will, call on each other and ask to borrow whatever. Kind of got the impression that that's what happened, pre-Prohibition times as well. Like, everyone's making their own malt, but your kiln has a fire, and so now you're out of commission for a little while. You would go to your neighbor and say, can I buy some of your malt, or your crop has a infestation or something like that, and so it gets wiped out. So you would then go and kind of like barter with each other. Those times about helping get each other with their raw materials, and I kind of have a feeling that that's sort of where RAR's malt got pushed around and shared with other breweries at the time.
Okay, interesting. So we were talking about back in those earlier times. Beer was seen as kind of like a, the less scary beverage to drink. It wasn't whiskey, and I've been to Louisville. I know what happens when people start drinking whiskey. It can get a bit wacky. So one of the questions we were talking about, taverns, saloons being kind of like a family thing. When did it start to shift to be not that?
So I'll take the first shot at it here. And a lot of it was done by the temperance advocates working through local option, where they would try and get alcohol banned locally if the state or the federal government wasn't going to do it. And even if they couldn't get that going, they would try lots of other intermediate regulations. The saloon might already be prohibiting women, except perhaps in a separate room accessible only from the back entrance. But they would also do things like banning furniture, because if you could actually sit down and enjoy yourself, people would go there. If you couldn't do that, why would anyone go to just drink? Or likewise, banning food, because if you could only just go there and drink, why would anyone go there? Well, it turned out the answer was to drink. And it's at this point that the saloon really started to gain a bad reputation, and part of that was definitely fanned by the Anti-Saloon League, who found it politically advantageous to do so. But there were really a lot of places which could be the level of den of iniquity, with all of the crime and gambling and vice that went along with those. So by the 1880s and 1890s, you're really starting to see some of that shift.
So if you're in this room sitting here, you've probably been to Northeast Minneapolis, I'm guessing. You can swing it, depending on where you are, you can swing a dead cat at like 3 breweries. Back in like the 1880s, it sounds like I had to, if I wanted to have a beer, I needed to leave the house. How far would I have to go to find a watering hole?
Well, it really depended on where you lived, Dan, and knowing you probably lived pretty close to the line that was drawn on the map between the alcohol region and the morally pure areas of the city. Because
That's right.
In 1884, Mayor George Pillsbury of the Pillsburys drew a line around downtown Minneapolis and northeast Minneapolis where strong alcohol could be served. And anything outside that line had to be a 3-2 bar, which that's a whole conversation. 3-2 beer, and the Minnesota still is like the last bastion of that to this day, I believe. Am I wrong? I think I'm right. So anyway, this is why the geography of bars is so stark in Minneapolis to this day, is because of this 1880s law that was done to ostensibly keep the labor pool for the big mills sober, so that you showed up to work and you could do your shift at the flour mill. You don't want hungover people operating these heavy machinery that can very much harm you.
So we're kind of getting towards prohibition. Okay. A question I have for you, we were talking about, different places. You want to be kind of right on the line of the Alcoholville and the Purityville.
I want to be on that line. I don't think most people did.
Yeah. Were there such things like, I know in your book you mentioned that there were a lot of dry areas. Where were the dry areas in the city? And, kind of like, I'm guessing St. Paul was not one of those things, or was it?
St. Paul's a whole other story. It's a little more obscure how it worked over there. It had a lot to do with the Catholic.
Did it involve pigeons?
Perhaps. The Catholic Church sort of determined how many bars could be in which parts of the city. In Minneapolis, it was like the mayor in the 1880s drew a line, and anything south of Franklin Avenue was, with the very small exception of the area where the Target is now, by Lake Street and Minnehaha and Hiawatha Boulevard, where I'm talking about, that was called Hell's Hub of Hell. And that was by the rail yard, which is like where we are now, and that was where all the working class workers would be, and working third shifts and stuff. So there was so many bars there, and they were exceptional to the structure of the city. But anything south of Lake Street or Franklin Avenue even would be a dry area, 3-2 only. And if you wanted like a real alcoholic drink, you either had to work with a bar owned by the mob, or it would be like a club, like the VFW. So you bring in your own bottle, and it was all very weird.
Okay.
But yeah, it wasn't like a proper saloon like in Wisconsin would have.
Okay. So we talked about the first brewery being York that opened up in 1849. What was the first bar that opened in Minnesota?
Pig's Eye, probably.
Yeah, probably Pig's Eye's Saloon in 1840.
Well, hold on. I thought that the oldest running bar, maybe it's the oldest running bar, is the one we were talking about earlier in New Ulm, the Turner Hall, the Rathskeller at Turner Hall. I think that was, if you look at their sign, I think it's, do you know what I'm talking about, Doug? It's like
1860 something.
It's 18.
But of course, that qualified as a club. So right. They could dance around some of those regulations.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know how you would answer that question. I think in St. Paul, there's debate between Newman's Bar, North St. Paul, and Spot Bar on Randolph Avenue.
I always thought it was the Spot Bar.
Yeah, that's where my heart lies. But Newman's, I don't want to pick sides on this thing, man.
Okay. Yeah. We want to keep it civil.
That's what you wrote your book for.
I was going to crack.
Newman's has bullfrogs. If you ever go there, it's pretty interesting.
What's a bullfrog?
Is that like a drink or what?
It's a large frog. It's not a drink at all.
It's a frog? It's an amphibian?
Yeah, it is.
It sounds like they're the next ones for the raw malt test.
Yeah. Who do the frogs like?
I mean, I've been to breweries that have had cats and birds. I've never seen a bullfrog in a drinking establishment.
All of you need to go to Newman's, is what I can say. North St. Paul. It's a wonderful old bar.
You heard it here first. After party at Newman's. I'll see you there. If you're allergic to frogs, don't go. Okay, so one of the other things we kind of talked about that we're getting towards that prohibition era. Talking about temperance movement things. Is that kind of like that spilled right into it? Because one of the things I thought would be kind of fun for the audience is to kind of categorize the different time periods of beer bars in Minnesota. Thinking about, for example, when the taproom bill passed in 2011, that was started at a different era in Minnesota. So where, like, Minnesota becomes a state, some breweries open. That's kind of like how would you categorize that era?
Well, just for kind of a quick outline of that, I'd say really the first era is from 1849 to the end of the Civil War. And at that point, you've got some breweries in the Twin Cities area, some of the other larger cities. A lot of them are spreading down both the Mississippi and the Minnesota River valleys, but these are all really small, family-owned breweries. After the Civil War, you get a lot of pent-up demand and labor. There's more immigration coming again. So you've got the opportunity to get more breweries. The ones that are already around are bigger. And the fact that the railroad is really starting to spread throughout the state by the 1870s means you can have breweries where it would have been really inconvenient before, and the advent of artificial refrigeration means you don't have to dig caves, especially in western Minnesota, through the Sioux Quartzite, which is just insanely hard rock. So there's that period. And then I would say about 1890, there's the next break, because a lot of those families are starting to lose control of their breweries. Either they don't have the next generation that wants to take it over, or they're losing in the competition to the bigger breweries that can ship in from the Twin Cities or Milwaukee or St. Louis. And so if you were going to start then, you really had to start bigger. And this is when we first start to get corporate breweries. Prohibition, of course, is its own period, and I'm sure we're getting to that in a minute. I would really say the entire post-Prohibition period from 1933 to 85 is one long period where you had the big commercial brewers, a few small town producers were hanging on, but they were all making a lager, occasionally a bock. They were pretty much all the same beer, and it was just a matter of branding or price. And so really when you get Summit starting up in 1985 and Page right after that, you have the beginning of the craft era. And I would agree with Dan, probably the next big and final era would be 2011, 2012, where you have the taproom bill go through, and you can start having facilities like this where you can sit around with the brewer, or in tonight's case, a whole bunch of brewers in the room, and enjoy the locally created beer just like you would have been having in 1870.
Okay, interesting. Well, speaking of Prohibition, I'm looking at our glasses. They're kind of empty right now. I feel like we don't want to slide right back into that. So we're going to take our little intermission, and I see some thirsty people in the audience, too. So we're going to take a little, 10-minute break, go grab another beer, visit the lovely bathrooms here at the Forgotten Star, and we'll come back. We're going to kick off the second half with a live Patreon shout-out segment to music, so you don't want to be late when you come back. Also,
were you going to mention questions?
yes, so I have some note cards up here and some pens. If you have a question that you would like the panel to tackle, please write it down so we can get to that in the second half. I think it could be a good sign or a bad sign that we're just through one page of my notes and we've already had a lot of fun. So we might have to edit the part where I do my interpretive dance, but that's okay. We'll do another show. So thank you. This has been a live episode of A One Pint Stand. Cheers. I didn't even have to use the applause sound effect. That was great.
Hey, thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you're enjoying A One Pint Stand. My aim is to help spread the word about craft beer. Enjoying craft beer is a passion of mine, and I love chatting about it with other people. A One Pint Stand has a goal of helping breweries tell their stories. I love to get out in and beyond Minnesota to visit breweries, beer bars, and meet other interesting beer people. If you are also into those things, you're probably going to want to keep tabs on the show. So go ahead and follow A One Pint Stand on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky. I also started a TikTok account because I was tired of Charles calling me a boomer for not having one. I would also appreciate any and all positive reviews on Spotify and Apple Music or wherever else you're listening to the podcast to help make it easier for other craft beer listeners to find us. If you want to be a supporter of the podcast with some of the extra change you find in your couch cushions, I have a Patreon. There are 3 different monthly levels of support, and they're priced at $1, $3, or $5 a month. If you pledge at the $3 or $5 monthly level, you get some pretty cool perks. So, go to patreon.com and search A One Pint Stand to check it out. We are up to 22 supporters, and I'm just really excited for what that means for the show. If you like reading about craft beer, check out my written work on aonepintstand.com. I love to write, and that's where you can find a lot of written content that covers both the local beer happenings in Minnesota as well as my craft beer travels. I truly appreciate you listening and taking time to enjoy our stories. Now, before we head back to the show, I want to talk about this episode's sponsor, Wandering Leaf Brewing Company. They are celebrating their 2nd anniversary on Saturday, April 26th, from noon to 10 p.m. in the tap room. The festivities will include special beer releases, live music, food trucks, pop-up food vendors, games, and of course, plants on plants on plants. So bring your family, friends, and doggos for what promises to be a great time at Wandering Leaf Brewing Company.
How about a beer?
Now, here we come back for the second half of this great thing, and you know we've got a lot of questions here. We got a lot of great material. We got a hot mic. We got a hot mic here. Before we stopped in the first half, we were just about to get to Prohibition, and we've got some questions that kind of relate to Prohibition. So, Doug, do you kind of want to talk us through what kind of led up to Prohibition? Is that my starch boxer setting that thing off? Because I wanted to keep it professional. We're good, okay. Do you want to kind of talk about kind of some of the factors? Obviously, it sounds like the temperance movement was gaining steam. And then, like, what did that do to the landscape of breweries, taverns? And then there's some questions about some specific breweries that came out on the other side, like Shell's. How did Shell's survive Prohibition?
All right, I'm going to use pretty much all of that remaining 2.5 hours here, right? So about 2 sentences on the temperance movement. There was temperance sentiment from pretty much the first moment that white settlers hit the shores. Many of them came for religious purity, though the early Puritans, Pilgrims, definitely enjoyed their ale, and it was still then viewed as a temperance beverage. Starting in the 1830s, the temperance groups really got going, and you started having a lot of societies where people would use moral suasion. Everyone would get together and take an oath and join a club that wasn't going to drink. Some of them even had what they called the triple vow: you don't drink, you don't smoke, and you don't swear. So these would work for a while, and the preacher who got them established would leave town and things would fizzle after about a year. But then what you really got going was first the Woman Christian Temperance Union, which got really going in the 1870s, followed by the Anti-Saloon League. And in a lot of cases, they had a point, because the men were taking their paycheck and they were getting a paycheck, and the only place they could really cash it was the saloon. They weren't banked, as we would say today. So, and if you're getting your paycheck cashed at the saloon, there's kind of an obligation that you honor the proprietor by buying a round. But then everyone else had to buy a round. There were some states or localities that actually banned treating, that you had to buy your own beer because of this incredible cycle of you needing to buy 12 beers to get out of there. So the Saloon League was beginning to paint the evil of America as the saloon, and it was easy to tie it to the brewers because their names were so prominent in the community, and because the breweries owned a lot of the saloon. And in Bill's books, he talks about some of the tied houses that were so prominent on the landscape, some of which still are. But by the there were a bunch of factors that came together in the mid-19 teens, and some states had been dry earlier, but the combination of World War I, where the raw materials were needed for the war. The barley was mostly going to be used for animal feed to raise meat. There was an expectation that the workers would be in a trench somewhere rather than in the malt house. And besides, we're fighting the Germans. So all of these things came together with the rising temperance movement, and by 1920, we have nationwide prohibition. And there's a lot of businesses that went out at that time, especially the newer breweries that had started big, had a lot of loans out, they weren't going to be able to make it by switching to ice cream. Some of the other ones had other investments. In the case of Shell's, as you mentioned, they were pretty much paid off, and they didn't have a lot of debt, so they could switch to other products, even though most of them didn't work. As far as the saloons could go, there was an awful lot of for sale property in 1919, 1920. And in fact, United Properties, which is still one of the biggest landlords in the Twin Cities, was Ham's saloon owning arm. So they had a lot of property to get rid of. Many of these, of course, would become speakeasies or ice cream parlors, if you can see my air quotes on the podcast. And as for many cases, it was, as Mo said in the epic Simpsons episode, that was a scary 10 minutes. And they were right back in business with different product.
So one of the things I wonder about is that I know that when I went on the Budweiser tour in St. Louis, they said that Anheuser-Busch, when Prohibition happened, they started buying up a lot of that stuff and a lot of the brands, and then when they came back, they just absorbed it all, and that was like one of the key factors of them kind of getting such a large market share. Was anything like that happening in Minnesota?
There were a few examples where brands moved from one brewery to another, but Minnesota none of Minnesota's breweries had the same kind of deep pockets, really, that Anheuser-Busch did. They were really in a league of their own by that point, along with Pabst and Schlitz. So most of Minnesota's old tied houses just moved on to other purposes or waited it out or became speakeasies. And again, Bill's got his mic up, and I'm going to let him field the next part of that one.
One of my favorite things about this is that the tied houses, so there are bars that were owned by the breweries. So you'd go there and there'd be only Glick beer or only Ham's beer or only Schmidt beer or whatever and they would be owned by the brewery. There's certain bars in the Twin Cities to this day where you look down at the tile beneath your feet and they reveal to you which brewery built that bar. So Palmer's is one of them in the West Bank. Cuzzy's is another one. So they have the same tile, and you can look down and it's like, oh, that's 100 years old, and that was all built by the same brewery. And it's kind of interesting. I just think that's cool.
And a lot of those breweries also provided all of the furniture. So there are people that collect old tied house bar chairs that have, a B in the back for Pabst, long story, or Blatz or Miller or any of those. I haven't seen many of those for the Minnesota breweries, but it was very common for the brewery to essentially buy all of the fittings for the bar in return for that exclusivity of sale. So no such thing in 1912 as we've got 150 beers on draft. We have a beer.
That's crazy. I think about now, they've got, 12 beers on tap here. You go to some places, it's 28 beers on tap. It's just so much. That's
all the
so
beers
foreign.
here are made by Forgotten Star.
That's true. That's true. Thank goodness for that. They're delicious. So we come out of Prohibition, kind of everybody's dusting themselves off, getting back up off the mat. What was that landscape like? And how did, the analogy of like when a forest burns down, yeah, it's bad because you lost your treehouse, but, new life springs back up. Is that kind of the mentality that people had, or were they like, well, shit, what do we do now?
Well, I can start with that. One of the most important factors is that the Cullen Act, which was the one that re-legalized what ended up being 3-2 beer, was one of the first things passed by the new Roosevelt administration in 1933. That was going to be one of the ways to help come out of the Great Depression. And most of the breweries needed a lot of work. So not only were brewers going to be reemployed, but so were coopers and plumbers and electricians and carpenters and tile guys and the people making all of the furniture for the newly reopened saloon. And there were a lot of estimates that the re-legalization of beer provided work for millions of people and brought in tens of millions of dollars of tax revenue. So it was looked upon as a real boon for the economy. And there were also a lot of breweries that tried to capitalize, or a lot of people who tried to capitalize on this new excitement. Now that beer is legal for the first time in 13 years, everybody's going to want it. We should open a brewery. And most of those got nowhere. In a lot of cases, they were trying to reopen an old brewery, which cost way too much to rehab than they were going to ever make from it. So, a lot of the ones that had a better financial situation beforehand were able to reopen, but there was a lot of irrational exuberance, and people ended up losing all of their investment because they opened a brewery either where it shouldn't be, or they didn't know anything about brewing, but they knew a lot about what they thought was going to be making money.
I can talk a little about the bar side of things, and looking at, I researched every bar in the Minneapolis and St. Paul city border, and the vast majority of them had an opening date in 1933, because that's like there used to be 10, 20 times as many bars as there are now, and they all opened right after Prohibition, and most of them, that's when they started.
From the ingredients standpoint, how did RAR BSG survive? I mean, obviously, you've got the advantage of like people are producing other things, so they still need raw materials. What did that look like?
Well, the way that I understand it is that going into Prohibition, RAR had their malt. We didn't have the malt house in Minnesota. There was a malt house in Wisconsin, Manitowoc, and they prepped for a couple of things. One, RAR is a German family, and so William RAR founded our company 1847 in Manitowoc, and when Prohibition was coming, having the last name of a German was not really helpful. And so they had changed their name to something a little bit more generic, called Cereal Products Co. They were also the first in, I guess, I don't know if in the country, but definitely Wisconsin, where they were able to roast malt. So they bought some roasters. They were able to take the barley and then turn it into black malt or roasted barley. And that was then used for things like coffee substitute or yeast nutrients and that kind of thing. So they were finding other ways to, in addition to making malt for making beer for medicinal purposes, or whiskey for medicinal purposes, they were using their new technology in roasting for more flavorful things like coffee substitutes and that kind of thing. But also, you guys are talking about, when I think about the kind of where we are when it comes to the agriculture of it, because malting barley is different than other kinds of grains. It requires it's no non-GMO for one, so that it's not at all manipulated, but it's selected for its different attributes and properties. And one thing that's kind of unique from the North American or U.S. barley versus, say, European or German barley is that our barley did go through this period of like prohibition, but then after prohibition we had, adjunct lagers and then consolidation. So we kind of only needed barley for making one kind of style of beer, which was this, adjunct lager that we're familiar with. And that requires, more of a higher protein, lots of enzyme. And it's not quite the same that we want for making all malt craft beer. That's kind of changed now with throwing oats in our hazy IPAs and whatnot. But nonetheless, at the time, that was a real difference, I think. So our United States have gone through a different barley evolution from what we can offer today, because we had this moment where our barley was, for many years, selected for making adjunct lager. And then we want to go, hold on, bring it back, rewind. We want now all malt lager. So we want like lower enzyme and lower protein and that kind of thing. And so it's just an interesting thing that happened to us. And that's probably one of the big differences between, like, say, malt that comes from Germany versus malt that we can grow here, or barley that we can grow here in the United States.
We come out of Prohibition, people are kind of getting back up, it's coming again, then World War II hits. What did that do? Because that negatively impacted a lot of, just because of resources, right?
Right. There were all sorts of grain shortages. Again, there was some talk.
Very few pigeon tests, what that means.
We're not wasting it on the pigeons at this point. There was a little bit of a move by some of the temperance advocates to try and bring back prohibition again, but some of the rhetoric they were using sounded exactly like the same things that the Japanese and German governments were saying about the decadent Americans, so it just really rubbed people the wrong way. But there were a lot of shortages. In fact, 1942 was the last year Bock beer was made for quite a while, because that requires more malt per batch. And the breweries were being asked to make usually the same amount of beer for 80% of their malt allotment. One of the things you got during World War II was a lot of breweries closing, but then being bought up immediately by another brewery who didn't care about their equipment, didn't care about their brands, they just wanted their malt allotment. So there were a lot of successful attempts by the brewers to get on the good side of public relations. And in fact, in 1945 in St. Paul, there was a landmark court decision that beer was in fact an essential wartime material, and therefore a strike by the local truckers was illegal because it violated the terms of the War Production Act. So beer was considered important enough to keep going, but there were all sorts of difficulties for the brewers. And the other thing that we did get out of that period was what we came to call malt liquor, which was either Glick or a brewery in Grand Haven, Michigan, or Ionia, one or the other. And they basically threw a bunch of whatever else would ferment in, knocked the alcohol content way up to mask it, and this became, at least here, Glick Stite, which came in a really bright green can and became known as Green Death. So some people may have thought that Heilemann Special Export was Green Death. Historically wrong. It was Glick Stite. It was a headache beer and deserved it.
Hazy IPAs, Green Death. Hold my beer. They were gonna quadruple hop this bad boy. Interesting. That's wild. Green Death. At what point, there was a good question here about the 3-tier system. So getting into and somebody, I'm going to kind of combine questions. We got way too. We're going to be here till midnight. So when we are talking about taverns, bars, etc., when do liquor stores enter the story, and why do we have municipal liquor stores, and how can we get rid of them? Should we get rid of them? And then when did the 3-tier system come into play?
My sense, Doug, is this is all right after Prohibition. They drew up the laws that way. Is that right?
Right, and not quite right enough after Prohibition, however. For the first couple of years, it was kind of a wild west as beer got re-legalized, but state governments didn't necessarily know quite what to do. The federal government was a little bit behind. So you could put all sorts of outrageous claims on your labels. You could make beer pretty much whatever strength you wanted to. I mean, you can again now, but not in 1935. And you could advertise it as, full pre-prohibition strength. You could market as extra strong. A couple of breweries proclaimed their beer the vitamin C beer, that Schlitz in particular.
Hazy IPAs, right? That's what I'm talking about.
So the 3-tier system was really designed to cut out the old idea of the tied house saloon, that the brewers couldn't own a retail operation, they couldn't own a wholesale operation, and it was designed, at least in the eyes of the creators, to break that big beer link with the local retailers. And the modern craft world has a lot of different opinions on the 3-tier system, some of which are printable. But at the time, it was seen as something that was necessary in order to prevent some of the evils of Prohibition, or of pre-Prohibition saloons.
I got to say, I worked at the state capitol for about 5 years, and the lobby that represents the liquor distributors is one of the most powerful lobbies at the state capitol in Minnesota, and that's why you still can't buy beer at the grocery store today. And they had the law until just a few years ago about Sunday beer purchasing, which is why we all have driven to Hudson. You all have. So it's just interesting to see how that kind of the origins of that particular policy and how it's played out over time, and whether it's still a good idea or not. I don't know. I think I don't know. Do you have strong opinions, Doug?
And that also varies by state. Wisconsin's franchising laws are much more restrictive than Minnesota. I've talked to a lot of brewers there who got trapped in with a bad wholesaler and just really could not get out. Minnesota seems to be a little bit more flexible for some of those things. I think that some modest adjustments to the 3-tier system, like we've had recently, probably solve a lot of the problems that the craft industry has with the 3-tier system. But I see Bob sitting back there, and he's not actually shaking his head at me. So, I think that one of the better things Minnesota did, for example, during the early days of COVID, was allow breweries to deliver, just like they did back in the pre-Prohibition era.
Doug Hoverson, master of the segue. That's the perfect thing into the next thing that I wanted to talk about. So you just referenced, it's been legal for breweries to sell their beer in different sized vessels for a little over 2 years now, give or take. From all of your research, what were some of the laws that had to be changed or enacted to allow us to kind of forge forward as opposed to be stuck? I mean, there's all sorts of crazy laws in every different state. One of the things in Pennsylvania, it was like illegal to buy anything less than like a case. So people go to liquor stores and they would like trade beers in the parking lot because it's like, well, I don't want 30 hams, I just want 27, and it's like, give me some of yours. But what were some of those things that kind of made it possible to get to where we are today?
Well, Minnesota was actually better than a lot of states as some of those things go. Pennsylvania, you could buy single bottles. at certain establishments or a case. And then there were a lot of states that had container size laws. So Florida and Texas in particular, in Texas, you couldn't have anything more than 24 ounces, and those old Foster's oil cans that we remember I remember so fondly from the 80s, were 25 ounces, so they just relabeled the ones they were sending to Texas as 24. So there are ways. But I think one of the things that Minnesota had was a real strict insistence on the 3-tier system. And also what this ended up doing was meaning that breweries could not sell directly to customers even on their own premises. So you could go to Ham, Schmidt, Grain Belt, take the tour, or Summit, and take the tour and get a free beer, but you couldn't buy a beer there because they didn't have the proper license. So a lot of it was an issue of licensing. Some of the things Minnesota did still turned out a little bit strange. If you go to a lot of the upper Midwest states, their crowler sizes are 32 ounces, not 24 ounces. So, it glitches in the law, sometimes just the way they write them, the random whims of a legislator that gets something into law. But I think the Sunday sales were a really big deal for a lot of people in the industry. And I think we're figuring out creative ways of getting the product to the people that want to buy it.
Yeah. Bill, from a bar standpoint, what were some of the legal and licensing obstacles that really prevented there from being a robust selection of places to get a drink all around the city?
Well, so speaking Minneapolis, specifically, they had a lot of blue laws that are kind of funny. I think did I mention the 1884 George Pillsbury liquor patrol limits? So drawing this line around Northeast on 4th Street. So if you look at 4th Street in Northeast, all the bars are on one side of the street. So Jimmy's, Mayslack's, Nightcap, the Northeast Palace, like they're all on one side of the street, and on the other side of the street, no bars. And that's because that is where they drew the line. And so, legally speaking, you can only have bars on one side of the street, and so they put them all on that. Or Spring Street Tavern and Moose on Monroe, whatever. They're all defining this territory that was set out in the 1880s. And that lasted for almost 100 years in Minneapolis. The geography of the city is really, to this day, just kind of a reflection of these arbitrary rules about beer and alcohol that were put in place by a mill owner, and so there's like my favorite story is Jimmy's Bar Northeast. That evolved over time, so they turned them into food ratios. So if you were a bar owner in 1969 in Minneapolis, you had to have a certain percentage of your sales be food and a certain percentage be liquor. It was like 70-30 or whatever. The ratio changes over time based on city council whims. But so at Jimmy's Bar, to this day, I think if you go in there, there's a menu on the wall and it says TV dinner's $110. And it's
in this economy?
Yeah. Well, now it's not. This is a while ago that I researched this, but now inflation, whatever. But so the point is, they if they were short on their food ratio that month or that quarter, they would have locals in the bar buy these TV dinners and then get free credit for their beer. So they would be able to send the receipt back to the city saying, oh yeah, we sold $3,000 worth of food just in one day because a whole bunch of people bought TV dinners, and and that's how they made that thing work out. And that was just obviously BS.
If you want another great example of where the line gets drawn, drive down 494 between Bloomington and Richfield. All the restaurants are on the Bloomington side. because the Richfield City Council would not, repeat, not grant anyone a liquor license within the boundaries of the city for many, 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 many years. And so the entire entertainment district of all the people coming out of games at Met Center and Met Stadium, may they rest in peace, had to go to Bloomington.
And that's the origin of the Fern Bar story and the Green Bay Packer bar that was around there at the same time.
So one thing I want to address, or this is a good question. We actually got two questions that kind of dovetail into each other, so I'm going to read them both. By the way, thank you. We had a lot of really great questions. Thank you, those of you who took time to write questions. Well, we'll start with this one. I don't know who did this, but, person after my own heart. Guess what? Chicken butt. Love it. Love it. I mean, it's great. That's, it's wonderful. It's like
There
I'm
are
back,
middle schoolers
It's like
here.
I'm back at work. Okay. So, how... I had an inkling. Okay. How did the evolution of the white class affect production, marketing, and jobs of beer? And then kind of loop this one in too. What role did the BIPOC community play in the industry after Prohibition?
So, interestingly enough, more than one might expect. One of the things that I found most interesting doing my Minnesota research was the fact that there was a large and long boycott of the major Twin Cities breweries by the black community in, I think, 1934, 35, and 36. And it was on the grounds that despite all of the employment that necessary at the breweries, they were refusing to hire any black people for them, despite the fact that most of the waiters recommending their beer at the fancy clubs were black people. And so the Minneapolis Spokesman, which was the black newspaper at the time, mounted an extensive campaign, which was essentially, why recommend the beer that won't hire you? And they were able to keep that going for a while. And one of the St. Peter breweries, Engesser, actually had a black driver. And so they began to supply some of the Twin Cities markets, which otherwise would have been a real reach for a very small brewery in St. Peter. So that was one of the earliest things that I noticed in Minnesota. I'll leave the Michigan book out of this here, but they had a much broader attempt to reach the black community and to bring black people into management. I would say that the beginning of really marketing to people of color rather than just using all the old German and English imagery that they used to use to market beer really began in the late 1950s with the recognition that there was real buying power beginning to come out of the black communities. So a lot of the larger breweries started to hire black sales reps, and not so much in Minnesota, but in some of the other states, actually began to target advertising to different communities of color. One of the things that you will see in Minnesota is that Hamm's, in their various California markets, had a lot of Spanish language ads. So not so much the Hamm's Bear, but some of the other ones about Land of Sky Blue Waters, they'd have an English version and a Spanish language version. And that this has been a continued struggle for a while because the creation of beer has so long been seen as this elite German or English idea that it has been difficult to realize that people of all types have taste, and people of all types have buying power and have the skill to create fabulous beers. And I think we're starting to get there now, and there's some people in this room who've been doing a lot to help make that happen. And there's obviously still a long way to go, but when we still view beer as that thing that Germans do in the beer garden, hoisting their steins around, can be limiting.
One of the fun things about researching the book that I wrote, the Closing Time book about the Twin Cities bar history, was that it's really hard to find a lot of good information about old bars because there aren't archives. But there was this amazing photography collection of a bar called Cassius's Bar in downtown Minneapolis that was on South 3rd Street. And it was the first black-owned liquor license in the history of Minneapolis in 1947 by this a man named Anthony Cassius. And you're looking through the archives trying to find like these little stories, you never know where it's going to lead you. And in this case, there was a photographer who had taken 50 photos over a period of a few years of the interior of the bar, showing like the culture of inside of bar. And that's really rare because most of the time bars never appeared in the newspaper unless they were being busted by the feds or there was a break-in or a robbery or murder or something. So like you never got the slice of life photograph or the story about like what people were doing on an everyday basis that wasn't like crime leads the story in KSTP on the nightly news. It's actually just like today. So so this archive of photos of the interior of Cassius's Bar was really a wormhole that led me and my co-author Andy Sturdivant down to research this, and we learned all about Anthony Cassius, who was migrated to Minneapolis from Oklahoma in the 1920s and applied to the city for this bar license. And you see these photos of like the black community, and you get a sense for how special this place was for people to connect. If you were just came in the Great Migration from one of the southern states trying to escape Jim Crow, you come up to Minneapolis for a job opportunity, and you go to Cassius's Bar because that's where you can talk to people, and they'll tell you where you can find an apartment. He can tell you where you can get a job. He can tell you how to hook up with someone who can help you with your taxes or whatever, like childcare, or maybe you just need a place to go to take a shower, or you want to know where to meet some ladies. Like, this is the guy that'll hook you up, and this bar was a real central hub for the community. And so it's a really interesting place. Like, it's a lot of these bars that were for the black community, specifically in Minneapolis, got bulldozed by urban renewal, and this one was in downtown Minneapolis, and the parking lot is still there, so you can kind of go and see where it would have been back in the day. But it's a unique story, I think.
So we're after Prohibition. We're kind of getting back. I want to fast forward a little bit to. In this country, you had big beer really took over. You had the Milwaukee breweries, Pabst, you had Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, and you had Hamm's and all that stuff. For a long while, it seems to me that beer did not have much variation. When did that change, and what brought about that change? And if anybody wants to run up and grab me another dry Irish stout, I don't want to take away.
Well, if I continue
Thanks, Andy.
If I can continue to be the master of the segue there, a lot of it was Americans who traveled overseas and often in the service of their country, and had been stationed in London or stationed in Bamberg, we're not worthy, and had thought, this beer is the same color that I'm having at home, but it tastes nothing like it. Or if they're stationed in England somewhere, this beer doesn't look anything like what I can get at home, and why can't I? And so there became this interest in much more widespread beer of different styles. And I think there were a lot of things that came together in the late 70s, early 80s, and one of them was the re-legalization of home brewing. And Jimmy Carter gets the credit for signing it, but Alan Cranston, senator from California, is the one who really got the legislation through. And this put together the labor force for what would be the craft brew movement. And also, it was not coincidental that during the Reagan years, the dollar was very strong, which meant imported beers were relatively cheap. So people of my vintage were able to get a lot of interesting German beers or the Sam Smith beers out of Yorkshire, just variety that we'd never seen before. And there were a number of people that worked on bringing the imports in, but they also thought, I'm already making beer like this. Why can't I go commercial? And part of the reason was that most states, Minnesota in particular, had really no laws about starting a brewery. They didn't have any laws that said you couldn't or that said you could. So what kind of permit would you pull for this precisely? So there were a lot of things that needed to be done. There wasn't the equipment yet. And most of those early breweries were described as Frankenbreweries. I got a couple of old dairy tanks. I've got a few kegs that my buddy stole from the store. A lot of the early brewers either already knew how to weld or they learned really quickly and pieced together whatever cooperage and equipment they could. And it was really an interesting experiment. And there was a lot of kind of mediocre beer being made at that point, but it was different, it was flavorful. Sometimes your bottles would explode and embed shards into the wall,
Or your wife's laundry basket. That's a fun story for the Patreon someday.
But the infrastructure and the labor is starting to come around, and Minnesota's a little bit later than some of the other states, though a little bit ahead of Wisconsin, amazingly enough.
So when people start homebrewing and they get a taste for variation, how does thank you, sir.
You've already poured it.
Why say no to a nice, delicious stout here in March? Yeah. Not all heroes wear capes. Thank you very much. So when we're talking, tastes start to change, and homebrew really is kind of leading the way. Did places like Raw Malting kind of plug into that and say, hey, we need to start looking at trying to get some of these exotic, different types of ingredients from across the pond here, so we can. Obviously, there's a desire for that.
Yes. RAR had a couple of customers leading up to craft brewing, and there was an opportunity to. They saw that there was some home brewing happening. There was a couple of breweries popping up. Mostly, we're talking about like maybe a Rock Bottom, maybe a Great Waters, maybe a Barley John's, maybe a what's the first English brewery, Sherlock's Home. There were some breweries in say Kansas City and whatnot that were starting up. And I think what they looked around and they saw an opportunity what they did is they went and collaborated with some homebrew supply shops. And these homebrew supply shops were the ones who were, had the specialty malts. They were the ones who actually had were importing malt from England and Germany and whatnot. But they didn't have the reach, and they didn't have the scale, they didn't have the financial ability to really service these breweries that were coming up. So they went and collaborated with, or I guess would say purchased like a homebrew shop in Mankato, and that then became what BSG started, and there was another fella, William Crisp, he from the Crisp malting. His family, he brought his family's malts over to the coast, to the East Coast and the West Coast, and so he had a warehouse in Rhode Island and a warehouse in California, and so with the combination of the homebrew shop that was in Mankato and then the two warehouses on the coast, this then became what was then BSG. And then from there, it's like, well, we better, the model was, we want to bring the flavors of the world to these breweries that are now offering, amber, stout, pale ale, wheat malt, or wheat beers, and give them the ability to make these authentic styles using ingredients from the countries that these beer styles are coming from. So you could, a Rock Bottom could make a Belgian beer using Belgian malt and English or French hops, and an English beer with English malt and whatnot. So I guess that was kind of the idea. It was like this thought that brew pubs are happening everywhere, and they don't have a great spot to go get all their ingredients from one location.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And then, that kind of ushers in the early part of craft. And so we're getting, here in Minnesota, we had brew pubs, like you just mentioned, but, there were also breweries. I mean, Summit opened in 1986, 85, 86, thereabout. But they couldn't sell their beer outside of a package. So we're kind of getting to the point where obviously now there's regional craft breweries available here, and you go into bars, there's tap handles of maybe some of the bigger West Coast beers that might be available. But what got us to, in Minnesota, the point where people start having conversations about, okay, we need tap rooms?
Well, I think part of it was just the plain difficulty, and this is something a lot of people in this room know more about than I do, but the difficulty of going up to the bar manager and saying, I'd really like to interest you in this Belgian double. Or, what do you think about a Weissenbach? And,
Gesundheit.
Yeah. I don't know why I picked the two that are definitely going to load up with the banana esters, but sure. I talked to a lot of brewers coming up, and the sheer doggedness that a lot of them had just getting a brewery or a bar to take on just one keg of their beer, just give it a try, see if anyone will buy it. And then, having to make sure all their friends went there and bought the beer to generate a little bit of support. It was, really guerrilla marketing in a lot of ways, and just really difficult. And if you look at any of the production numbers for even the really well-established Minnesota craft breweries now, the first few years were all really slow, and it wouldn't pick up for quite a while because you're fighting for space in the bar that only have so many tap handles and space on the shelves of the liquor store, where why should we carry your brown ale that nobody's heard of when we've got Newcastle? We know that'll sell. And so I think the tap room also comes relatively late to Minnesota compared to, say, Michigan and some of the other states around. But it means that the breweries now have a way to reach the customer directly.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody on the panel for being here, and thank everybody for coming out for the live show of A One Pint Stand. have a good night. Cheers.
Well, I'm sure that you're going to agree with me that the level of content for the live show went to 11. The breadth and depth that Doug, Bill, and Chris covered with their expertise was truly magnificent. You know, we barely scratched the surface of the beer and bar history of Minnesota. And I know that there is definitely a desire to do a part 2, so that will happen sometime down the road. Now, if it seemed like the show ended kind of abruptly, that's because it did. There actually was a medical emergency with one of the members of our audience who was actually a dear friend of a lot of our listeners. So that was shocking, jarring, and scary. Luckily, there were 2 nurses in the audience and several other great helpers who sprang right into action to help. And I'm happy to report that our friend is doing great and is no worse for the wear. I do want to thank Laura, Paige, Robin, Mahad, and Sophia for helping out. Also, Matt Asay at Forgotten Star had all the emergency equipment at the ready, so it went as well as something like that could possibly go. I was really touched by the way people responded because it showed how naturally selfless so many of you are. So we will have a sequel to our history chat down the road for sure. The other thing that I never got to do was thank the audience for coming. Again, if you're listening to this and you were in the audience for the live show, I want to thank you because the fact that you were willing to take time to come and listen to some beer stories was really important to me. It meant so much that so many people value learning about the beer history in Minnesota from some wonderful people. The vibe in the room was tremendous. I also want to give a special shout out to Bree Smith for crafting a bouquet made up of cured meat roses and various versions of my favorite modest beer, Super Deluxe. That act of generosity blew my mind. Now, I want to give a special thank you to Marcus Dotson, Chuck Dorsey, Vicky Epper, Daniel Fisher, Todd Fitzloff, Laura Fleischfresser, Matt Holton, Cable Lefto, Ben Michaels, Sophia Masagi, Brent Newman, Bree Smith, Jesse Storms, Sarah Cry-Valento, and Brian Wu for being Kegstander level supporters of the A One Pint Stand Patreon. You've all shown incredible generosity, and I'm grateful for it. Cheers to you all. Now, before we go, I want to give a shout out again to our sponsor for this episode, Wandering Leaf Brewing Company. Their staff have created a special atmosphere where everybody is welcome. They provide fantastic beers in a laid-back setting. Wandering Leaf is a great community gathering spot in St. Paul, so get over there and check them out. It's perfect for if you're bringing a big group to play a board game or if you just want to sit at the bar. And if you go, tell them that you heard about them on A One Pint Stand. So, thank you for listening, and this has been another episode of A One Pint Stand, a Minnesota craft beer podcast where the pants stay on, but the caps come off. Cheers.
Anybody ever seen Waiting for Guffman when they're... Ooh, tough crowd. Hey-o. Not all the jokes are going to land. Okay, we're back. Hey-o. There it is. All right. What is this, an audience or an oil painting? Ay, caramba. Okay, we're back.